Hello and welcome to this episode of Business on the Wire. As the world begins to rearrange its dynamics post COVID and through COVID, what are the lessons for India, both in terms of economics, in terms of foreign policy, and indeed how to restructure systems to handle a pandemic like this? Joining me to talk about that, a man who has a bird's eye view of many of these issues, Samir Saran, who heads the ship at ORF or the Observer Research Foundation. Samir, thank you very much for joining in.
Samir, always a pleasure chatting with you. And much has happened in the last couple of months, both globally and locally. Are there any immediate, clear lessons already in place as we, still plan to emerge from COVID?
I think it's too early to take lessons from the pandemic itself. It's a fast evolving and a dynamic challenge. But I think one clear observation should be made. We were not prepared. I think the first lesson and the only lesson that we can take at this stage is that our global systems failed us, and the inequities and frailties of domestic systems are failing us. And hopefully, before we are through this pandemic, it could be 12 months or 18 months, depending on which report you read, we should have made progress and we should take steps to address those. Opportunities like these sometimes compel us to take essential steps, make important reforms, and I hope we can draw the lessons, invest in human capital, invest in social infrastructure, build our capacities around health, education, nutrition, public services, and governance capabilities, because these have certainly been found wanting. On the international arena, I think as UN turns 75, this pandemic tells us it is an old man or an old woman. UN has aged badly. It is failing. It is flailing. UN institutions such as the WHO were ineffective. It's time for radical reforms. And while we should not be defunding them at this moment, and we should not be pulling the rug under their feet while the pandemic is on, I think they require radical rethinking if they are to serve the purpose of the century.
You've called out two of those protagonists in the tale. One is WHO, and the second is, of course, China, which I'll come to later, Samir. But do you think that the world is sort of ready for that? And that seems to be the mental shift or tilt right now, that it's time to restructure the UN for something newer, or at least to just give it a shake-up?
I think the world is ready to accept that these institutions don't work. I am not so sure that the world is ready to put in the effort required to rebuild them or recast them. I think it is always easier to pull out, like the American administration has threatened to do, than to remain engaged and rebuild it. So I think the global appetite to invest in institutions that is required may not be there.
Similarly, I would ask you then, Samir, whether you think the world is, willing to take on the changes that you alluded to earlier in terms of health systems, because right now it seems the eye is very clearly on the capital markets ball. You want to pump in enough money to keep that up and afloat and still looking, optimistic. Do you think that time and effort and money will be rerouted into these spaces where it is sorely required?
History tells us no. Hope tells us it must. After the financial crisis, we promised ourselves we would never allow an economy to be so over leveraged, so overheated. We won't allow bubbles to arise. What happened? I think in a few years from the crisis, we had taken positions in the market far higher than before. So I think human being and human greed don't allow us necessarily to course correct easily. This pandemic may be different. Some countries are going to take the corrective measures. Some countries have understood the importance of investing in certain systems. So I see a partially reformed world or partly reformed world emerging out of this crisis. I will still bet on certain regions going back to the old ways.
Let me look inward on that topic of health then, Samir. I mean, India ranks 184th out of 191 in terms of, percentage GDP that is spent on healthcare. It's less than 1.5% for a population that obviously needs it, not just the pandemic, but otherwise as well. Do you think India has a lesson to learn as well for healthcare from this?
I think clearly. I think India was clearly underprepared. In fact, India is still underprepared. One of the reasons why we had to enforce a very stringent lockdown was because of our clear awareness that we have a very thin infrastructure, health infrastructure layer. Even a modest crisis or a modest surge in infections would have overwhelmed it. Our lack of capacity to handle even minimal number of patients has compelled policy decision making in this time. Now, I'm not saying that if we had a great infrastructure, we would not have gone for a lockdown. So don't get me wrong. You've seen the most sophisticated health systems get overwhelmed. New York City is reeling, right? Rich countries with big systems and big investments are also not doing that well. So, however, I think our case is different. We are a very different society to many of the Western countries. We have far-flung areas which are undergoverned or ungoverned. We have communities that are underserved or not served at all. We have challenges of even collecting samples from number of districts. They have to travel hours to get to a collection center. These frailties must be removed. And I think the percentage of GDP spent on health has to at least double. And even after doing that, it will be insufficient. So we will also have to find ways of raising money from other actors. So India, because of its tax to GDP ratio, will never have a government size big enough to serve all its governance needs. In the G20 list, the tax to GDP ratio is smallest, or maybe is the second smallest as far as India is concerned. I think it's probably the smallest. Now, if that is the case, it tells you that the capacity of the government is the least compared to its global peers amongst the G20. And therefore, to do anything, healthcare, education, water supply, any of the essential social infrastructure, they will have to be very creative. We will have to raise money from outside. We will have to put a larger portion of our GDP on the table. We will have to leverage it in clever ways so that we can deliver bang for bucks.
It's interesting you say that, Samir, because that's a point some other, India watchers have made, that we are not in the position to play it like the US, which is, let's put 10% of our GDP into pulling the economy out of this. We will indeed have to go out and start borrowing from some of those financial institutions that you just referred to. Does that look like the likely way out of this, economically speaking?
I mean, so let me take a hypothetical situation. Let's assume that India would require 10% of its GDP to stimulate its way back into normalization. I'm just picking a number, 10%. It could be 4, it could be 8, it could be 12. I suspect India may not be able to put that kind of money on the table. India may not be able to put $300 billion on the table to give to the auto sector, power sector, steel sector, SMEs, agriculture, loan waivers and subventions, salaries, etc., etc., etc. So India by itself may not be able to put the $300 billion or any amount that wise men decide or wise women decide is important for its stimulus. India will probably be only able to do 2/3, 3/4, or half of it. We will have to find others to put the rest of the money. Now, how do you make others put rest of the money? And I think that is, again, something we need to start planning for now. In the next 12 months, we must come up with a India investment package, because we will require close to $150 billion of quick money coming in from outside to collaborate with our own money and create a significant stimulus to the economy. One way of doing it is to tell the world, you all have to meet your Paris commitments. You all have to invest in responding to climate change. We could be your single biggest mitigation project. We will stimulate our energy sector, our auto sector, our city building projects in a manner that we create the largest green undertaking the planet has ever seen. And we could be your single point investments for mitigating carbon emissions for the future. So we will have to think out of the box. I'm giving you just one example. The second could be the digital sector, that we are taking the largest digital public goods undertaking. And why don't you come and invest with us and create a bottom of the pyramid digital world where we will, without intellectual property or with low intellectual property barriers, be able to create digital solutions for the entire world, which this pandemic has told us is indeed needed. So we will have to be very clever in putting together an India investment package that partners with India's own capacities to invest in itself and doubles or triples the stimulus capacity that exists today.
Movement there has been staggered, of course, but one area where movement has already come is with regards to foreign policy, Samir, especially with a topic that has been one of your favorites recently, which is China. There were some interesting guideline tweaks that came out with regards to FDI, and it looks globally as well like people are really taking a hard relook at how they want to engage with China as business partners or otherwise.
So, I've always argued that China still behaves like a developing country, while it is now undoubtedly amongst the two most important actors in the world. Now, when you have such huge clout in world affairs, monetary clout, political clout, you will have to transform your internal organization so that you become far more transparent and you are able to engage in far more direct conversations with those who you impact. The Americans were able to do that. They may not have been any kind of benevolent hegemon. My entire book with Shashi is based on the failure of Pax Americana. So I have written 300 pages on criticizing the American-led global order. I've only written 200 pages on Pax Seneca, which is the Chinese growth or Chinese emergence. But let me put it this way: while the Americans were never benevolent and never kind to everyone they engaged with, they had created what one of my colleagues, someone who I admire a lot, Ashley Tellis, once described as penetrated democracy. They allowed their democratic processes to be penetrated by outsiders. Indians can go and write in the media. We can also go and petition their congressmen. We can also create advocacy groups. We can create pressure points. We can lobby their Congress. We can lobby their senators. We can be part of American decision-making processes that will eventually impact us. Has China done this? If you want to talk to someone in China and tell them to change their internal policy, who do you talk to? Who do you speak to? China has not created a sophisticated funnel which allows the world to have a conversation with itself. Now that leads to great distrust and discomfort. And this lack of transparency is going to impede China's acceptance as a very important global actor. This is what is happening today. Countries don't trust China. The political deficit is beginning to create an economic barrier for China's expansion. Countries are going to de-risk supply chains. They're going to move their manufacturing bases because of this. They are also going to rethink the terms of engagement in terms of other economic and financial activities with China. India has done the same. The Germans are planning, or Germans have already introduced something similar. The British are threatening to walk out of the 5G project. The French have also relooked at their investment norms. Smaller countries are preventing China from taking over their infrastructure investments, infrastructure projects, such as Czechoslovakia. The Czechs, sorry, not Czechoslovakia. The Czechs have clearly indicated that they are not going to be engaged in a business as usual with the Chinese. So you are seeing a renegotiation of the world with the Chinese in the form and format of business they will do with them. Now, if the Chinese are smart and if the Chinese are receptive, they will open themselves up. I think there is no reason for China to remain behind the Great Wall anymore, right? So if the Chinese are smart, they will find ways of engaging and assuaging people's concerns and anxieties and resetting their entire approach to globalization. If they are not smart, they are increasingly going to face this pushback. And the Indian tweak currently is that pushback.
It is. It's built on an ideology, though, Samir, from decades and decades. Would you go so far as to say that if it does not change meaningfully in terms of how they engage with the world, there is a chance China does not remain the superpower that it was once we come out of this post-COVID era, whenever that may happen?
I think China will always remain a superpower simply because of its size and scale now, but it may eventually find itself boxed into a certain grouping. The Chinese may not find acceptance all over the world. They will probably still find a good clutch of 50, 60, 70, 80 countries who will engage with it, who need the Chinese surpluses, who need the Chinese technology, who need Chinese know-how. But increasingly, they will find their options more limited. And therefore, once that starts happening, you will see probably an emergence of some form of zones or spheres of influence. One in which the Chinese have great agency, others where they have more limited engagement. While it might be premature to think of it as a Cold War, but I would think that you would see, as the Russians describe, a new format for hot peace emerging. That while you will engage all over the world, in some areas you will have unfettered access, in others you will have gated globalization.
Hot piece. I like that one. There is a sense, Samir, that when you hit these kind of pockets, unforeseen pockets, there are certain ripples that are actually an effect of already long-standing problems. It just comes to a cataclysmic point, and two of them are inequality and globalization. How do you think both these tracks are going to move?
And I think both are intimately related to each other. I think the formats of globalization have, in some ways, fostered inequality. And the last 20 years of technology induced globalization has concentrated wealth in fewer number of people. So, in many ways, globalization as we know it today is not necessarily a word which is very popular in many streets around the world, including in Europe, including in the US. You've seen the rise of certain kind of leaders who have actually capitalized on this anti-globalization sentiment. And for people, globalization means different things. If you ask someone in Italy, globalization means ceding control to the bureaucracy in Brussels and they want to take it back. If you talk to some other country, it might mean either Chinese or American hegemony and they want greater agency. So globalization means different things to different people. But so one thing is certain, that the format of globalization, which has allowed this kind of concentration of wealth in a few hands, needs revision. And if it is not revised, globalization will die. Globalization as we know it will no longer exist. Of course, there will still be interconnection, trade, and economic engagement, but it will be partial, it will be polarized, and it will be within restricted circles.
The optimist might believe this is India's chance to really make its moment in the sun, Samir. Here's where you grab opportunity to be the backroom player that China has. You start engaging greater with some of your regional partners. And the pessimist would believe that up until now, economic reform has been disappointing. Earlier, it was growth versus development. Now it's neither, that we are struggling both positions with. Which side of that?
I'm a possibilist. I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist. I am someone who's always been a
possibilist. The possibilist. This is a new term for me.
that I learned from a very famous scholar thinker. I think it was Hans Rosling who said this, that I see possibilities. And I think that's something that kind of suits my engagement with issues as well. So I'm a possibilist. I think the next 18 months offer India a few possibilities. Chiefly, if we get through this crisis with a degree of success in protecting our people, and when I say protecting our people, it's both life and livelihood. If we get through the next 18 months fairly modestly successful, I think we would, the world would take notice. The ability to be able to respond to development challenges, protect our people from the pandemic, use our technologies to deliver certain services, reinvest or invest in the social infrastructure we were discussing earlier. I think India would have come up with its own unique model of crisis management, model of development, model of growth. I think that offers India a great chance. It offers India a great chance to not necessarily respond to Western capitalist demands or communist authoritarian systems, but to prove to the world that low-income democracy is able to deliver a system and a process and outcomes that are appreciable. And I think if India is able to do that, we would have really climbed up the ladder in terms of global influence. If we are unable to do it, then I think the pessimist side starts coming into play. That neither do we have a thriving capital market, nor do we have a great manufacturing base, and on top of that, we would have been saddled with misery and pain that the pandemic leaves behind. And there, we would require years of rebuilding. And I think this is something that I believe the Prime Minister, the Chief Ministers, the Indian state is cognizant of. And that is why you see that although we have a dysfunctional public sphere, mainly Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc., we still seem to have a coherent federal arrangement. Despite all the noise and chatter, you see the political class working rather closely, especially in key geographies.
Hmm. How do you think that rearrangement is going to move from here, Samir? Will it still remain a bit of a center versus state situation where the better states or the more competent states stand out, and those governments are rewarded for that? Or do you think it's going to be a much more collaborative way of working, regardless of which political party is in power in which state?
No, I mean the first 1 month, as it were, tell us that it is a collaborative arrangement. Now, of course, we have already discussed that the Indian state is rather weak state, both in terms of its fiscal space available to it, as well as in terms of governance capacities. I mean, it's not something that should be surprising to us. We know through various reports that are available in the public domain that we have an understaffed police force, we have less people on the bureaucratic beat, we have a judiciary that is much smaller than it needs to be. We all know that India has a governance weakness, India has a fiscal weakness. It's not surprising, right? But in spite of that, you see collaboration. Now, states which have forward-looking, strong, smart chief ministers are doing better. It's not that they are getting anything special from the center. They're not getting something additional from the center. I think they are running with what is available and building their own arrangements to protect their local populations. So this is a period where you will, of course, have to see the center step up. And I think I should identify two areas where they need to do more. They will need to hasten the process in giving states more fund transfers. I think the states need to have greater agency. They are the first line of response. They are the first responders, and they need to be empowered to create context-specific solutions for their people. So how quickly can and how fast can we raise and transfer money to the states is one proposition for the center. And second, of course, the center has to defend the big industries. So while the first part attends to the livelihood and lifeline questions for the migrants, the labor, the agri communities and economies, the second part center has to defend is wealth and value. Now, I know this is a bad word in India, but if you don't have large industries, if you're not able to compete in the world in terms of your auto sector, your energy sector, your exports from various segments, your fiscal space will shrink. So you also have to defend your industrial sector as you first and foremost protect your individuals in the country. So the center's job is to protect the individuals by empowering the state. And the second job is to create the regulatory ecosystem, the India investment package, the attractiveness that will allow the industry to come back into its own as quickly as possible.
Mm. My final question to you, Samir, what's been deeply disturbing about this COVID episode is that, every country has sort of identified with one major crisis. For the US, it's obviously economic with the unemployment figures, the jobless claims. For Italy, it's been a complete health breakdown with the number of lives lost. For India, unfortunately, it seems to be looking like a humanitarian crisis more than anything else. I mean, these images of lakhs and lakhs of people on the road with access to neither food nor transport nor any kind of support is really heartbreaking.
No, I would completely agree with you that for India this is a humanitarian challenge, and if you go back in time, you would find that floods, extra monsoons, droughts, or any sort of weather events or natural events would largely result in terrible human misery, loss of life and pain. And that is fundamentally because, as we discussed, we have very little state capacity to offer and guarantee the lifeline existence that the 1.3 billion Indians need. So any such challenge is going to become a humanitarian disaster. Now, this is the India possibility that I see, that you have 1.3 billion Indians. Your single most important task is to protect each one of them, is to make sure that you feed each one of them, is to make sure that you offer some form of employment or employment guarantee to each one of them, is to create a mechanism that you can bring a large number of them back into productive work and wages as soon as possible. And if you can do this, you would have done what India has in different instances done in the past. I think this is an opportunity for us to deploy the undergirding that we have, which, and by the way, that seems to be one of our frontline instruments, which is the public administration undergirding that we have. To use that public administration undergirding and to make sure, and this is why I was distressed and I tweeted out as well. When I was distressed with what was happening in terms of the migration between Delhi and Uttar Pradesh and what is happening in Bombay or what you saw in Surat and Gujarat. And again, this is not an ideological issue. This is a human issue. These are three states which have the largest number of migrant workers, Delhi, Gujarat and Maharashtra. It is bound to happen here. It is also the place where you have the transitory workers. So it is bound to happen here. Now, on day one, you could argue that, they were overwhelmed. The Indian state was overwhelmed. But on day 21, we should have been prepared. And I think that the public administration must be given one single clear instruction that no Indian should sleep empty stomach. When you have grains and rice in your granaries, it is time to unload it. When you have certain surpluses, it is time to deploy them. When you have the capacity to do it, a ration card should not be the basis of denying it. When someone asks me that should we issue more ration cards, I said in these pandemics, it is time to tear down the ration cards. There is no requirement for anyone to be that anyone should have to identify themselves to fill their stomach. It doesn't matter if you feed 5% extra people, but 5% hungry people should not be the result of any great bureaucratic arrangement. So it is a humanitarian crisis. We need to feed them. We need to get them back to their jobs. We need to keep them safe till then. And we need to do all of this differentially because every state has a unique situation. And therefore, I come back to my earlier point. The center will have to trust and empower the state to deliver this. I think there should be some checks and balances and some rewards and incentives for states to do this better. But trying to do it out of New Delhi is not going to result in great success. You will have to do it federally. You will have to do it through cities. You will have to do it through smaller political units to manage it in a manner which is efficient.
So it was a joy chatting with you, Samir. Thank you so much for joining in with all your thoughts. I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Mitali. And stay safe.
I'm going to stop recording first.